Hello and welcome to this interview. My name is Andrés Gómez Emilsson, and I am one of the co-founders and officers of the Stanford Transhumanist Association. Today I've got the huge honor to meet David Pearce here in San Francisco. David is no doubt one of the most well-known transhumanist philosophers. Among his many activities, he is known for starting the World Transhumanist Association with Nick Bostrom and for writing the Internet Manifesto, The Hedonistic Imperative, as well as The Good Drug Guide, and more recently the Biointelligence Explosion, how recursively self-improving organic robots will bootstrap their way into super-sentient, full-spectrum superintelligence. Concretely, Dave is also the founder and leading figure of the cultural movement and transhumanist subculture called abolitionism, which focuses on promoting the eradication of suffering as a feasible and imperative project. In addition, David is also one of the few contemporary philosophers who takes seriously the implications of altered states of consciousness, something that has made him known as one of the members of the new wave of psychedelic visionaries. So today I will take my chances and probe David's mind with burning questions addressing why transhumanism is important. I suppose like the most burning question is, why does suffering matter? And why should we abolish it altogether, say, rather than have a middle way approach?
So the question, why does suffering matter, could only really be asked by someone who wasn't actually undergoing suffering themselves. And if right now you were racked by despair or excruciating pain, the fact that suffering matters and matters intensely would be self-intimating. So it's only the luxury of, let's say, listening to this interview in a relaxed circumstances that even allows you to ask this question. How to actually phase out suffering? It's an immense challenge. There's nothing conceptually new about it. One can look back to, let's say, Buddhism, which is predicated around overcoming suffering and doing so via the Noble Eightfold Path. It's implicit in classical utilitarianism. What's different now is really that for the first time technology allows us to seriously think about doing so. And by abolishing suffering, I mean just in humans, ultimately throughout the living world. How to do it? Okay, for a start, just a very crude existence proof. If one implants microelectrodes in the reward centres of a human or non-human animal, the human or non-human animal will continue to self-stimulate indefinitely. This is not, I hasten to add, the way I see as the way forward for intelligent life in the universe, but it's interesting that there's no physiological tolerance that is shown there. And there's no reason to think it would have been any harder for natural selection to engineer life based on, let's say, gradients of intelligent bliss rather than life based on gradients of discontent. It just simply happens to have been the case that in the ancestral environment of adaptiveness, it was fitness enhancing for organic robots such as us to be discontented a lot of the time. So, okay, what are we going to do about it if we're not going to have something like crude wireheading? One option is some form of psychopharmacology, drugs. Today's recreational drugs, probably not the way forward. For a start, what they tend to do is they simply kick into gear the negative feedback mechanisms of the brain, such that a user of a euphoriant drug will first be, crudely speaking, high, or less crudely, to enjoy states of immense well-being, unfortunately then followed by a low or a crash. And today's so-called clinical drugs, unfortunately, are very mediocre too, and they don't really seem to yield sustained well-being. But I think the long-term way forward lies in a sense, re-engineering ourselves to editing our unpleasant genetic source code. Two particular elements here. One is before having children, I think all prospective parents have an obligation to actually choose the genetic makeup of their future offspring to ensure that they're not bringing more wanton suffering into the world. Now, this sounds very futuristic, but I'm just going to give just a couple of examples about what we could do right now. It'd be possible for all prospective parents to use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to choose, let's say, benign alleles of the SCN9A gene. The SCN9A gene modulates the level of physical pain sensitivity of your future child. And nonsense mutations will elicit complete insensitivity to pain, which for now at least will be probably unwise. Other allelic variations confer unusually high or unusually low pain sensitivity, and it makes sense to choose benign, low pain versions of the SCN9A gene for your future child. Okay, that's, crudely speaking, physical pain. What about psychological pain? Well, each of us has what one might call a hedonic set point around which we tend to fluctuate in the course of a lifetime. A number of studies suggest that 6 months after either winning the lottery, becoming quadriplegic in an accident, one will have reverted to one's previous level of well-being or ill-being before the accident or the happy win. And one thing that prospective parents can do is choose benign alleles for their future offspring that ensure that their future offspring has a relatively high hedonic set point. i.e. we're not talking about uniform bliss here, but simply the hedonic treadmill being calibrated so that you have a naturally happy child. And this is a concrete instance. The COMT gene, or catechol-O-methyltransferase gene, has two alleles. One, crudely speaking, is associated with a high hedonic set point, a capacity to have many rewarding experiences. The other, nastier allele, is associated with an impoverished predisposition to to less in the way of rewarding, to fewer in the way of rewarding experiences, and that I would say any prospective parent has an obligation to ensure that their future child has both low pain alleles and a predisposition to being happy. Now, how far we actually go in the direction of creating super happy children, that's open to debate. But by reducing both predisposition to physical and emotional pain, we are diminishing the burden of suffering in the world. That's our prospective children. Now, clearly we want interventions that can enrich the well-being of people alive today. I think we also have an obligation to alleviate and then eventually abolish suffering in the rest of the living world too.
So one of the questions that springs from your current discussion is, I mean, I get that people would say, generally speaking, they would prefer to have a happy child than a miserable child, but I do expect that this sort of talk elicit a response in people that they might say, well, doesn't the child have a right to be sort of like an unaltered human, so to speak, or live the experience of a biologically natural, so to speak, starting in the baseline that we evolved to experience?
I think the question is, what should be the natural default state of your future child? Should the natural default state be of well-being or comparative ill-being and discontent? Each child alive today is a unique genetic experiment, such as the nature of sexual reproduction. Even identical twins, due to epigenetic factors, are in fact genetically unique. So the question is it ethically responsible to continue just to throw the genetic dice and just see what happens and put our faith in God or Mother Nature, or should we use a little bit of forward planning and ensure that our offspring lead rich and fulfilled lives? I was going to ask, as I said, though the word natural has all sorts of positive connotations, I mean, what is it to be a human being? We have the characteristics, essential characteristics, the core emotions we do today because they helped our genes leave more copies of themselves than the African savannah, or the so-called evolutionary environment of adaptiveness. And all sorts of feelings we have, something like, for instance, jealousy or anxiety, they're not so much good for the individual. They were good for our genes in the certain sense of maximising their inclusive fitness. And giving your child this supposed right, for instance, to experience sexual jealousy or something like that, why? In what sense is it helping your child as an individual to grow? So I would say the default state for any form of life one creates should be well-being. By all means, if consenting adults wish to explore any states below hedonic zero, allow them to do so. But to create deliberately the biological substrates of suffering, I think will one day be recognised as a form of child abuse.
I see. So in essence, I mean, the argument boils down to, no matter what, when you have a child, it's a genetic experiment. Why not make sure that at least there's no disaster in that sense, and possibly raise the baseline?
Yes, yes.
As a negative utilitarian, you emphasize the importance of reducing suffering as a moral imperative. In your writings and in your talks, you still say that strong pleasure or like bliss is highly desirable, but you treat it as something in a different category. Like on the one hand, we have a moral imperative to reduce suffering, and on the other hand, we have mere desirability. So how does this distinction come about?
Intuitively, there's a very appealing symmetry to pleasure and pain, and this is what a classical utilitarian would argue. And as you rightly stress, I very much look forward to an era in which our descendants, and just conceivably our elderly selves, may enjoy life based on gradients of intelligent bliss. But nonetheless, there is an asymmetry here, that if someone is undergoing pain, whether physical pain or emotional pain or both, there is something self-intimatingly wrong or unsatisfactory about that state that needs to be changed. Whereas if you have inert matter and energy, or for that matter someone who is happy, any possible need to increase, to generate happiness anew, or to increase that existing well-being, it's not self-intimating in the same way. I said I personally very much hope that we don't settle for the mediocre and go on for the sublime. But in terms of moral urgency, I think tackling suffering is our greatest responsibility. Just one point, although I personally happen to be a negative utilitarian, it is possible to believe we should phase out the biology of suffering, and even that we should go on to enjoy life based on gradients of intelligent bliss and not be any kind of utilitarian at all. One could be a deontologist, a virtue theorist, an ethical pluralist, even someone who's religious who believes in a benevolent God, and still think that it is ethically desirable for us to phase out involuntary suffering. So long that is, as we're not aiming simply for maximum bliss, but to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill. This is the beauty of genetic recalibration of your hedonic set point. It doesn't involve sacrificing, if you don't want it, sacrifice anything significant of your existing preference architecture, except insofar as your preference architecture involves being committed to the creation or perpetuation of suffering.
Some deontologist thinkers might complain that sort of doing experimentation in order to raise the hedonic set point would induce certain disasters almost by necessity. Like there might be some mistakes, there will be some errors, and if we follow the line of reasoning of the trolley problem, for example, in classical deontological puzzles, it would follow naturally that they would be very against doing these experiments, just in the off chance that somebody will experience great misery as a consequence, even though on average it would be maximizing pleasure and minimizing suffering.
It's certainly worth considering in immense detail and possible depth all the conceivable things that can go wrong. If you look at the track record of utopia and utopian schemes in history, time and again, they seem to involve the actual production of more suffering than the suffering they were actually supposed to relieve. One possible answer to this worry is that if one eliminates the molecular signature, the biological substrates of suffering, the very meaning of anything going wrong changes. So it's not possible for this kind of engineering to unwittingly produce more suffering. I mean, to the deontologist, I might argue that it's possible to use molecular biology to heighten our sense of obligation and duty. So, yes, whatever kind of ethical system you have, it would be possible to use biotech to prevent what the Greeks used to call akrasia, or weakness of will. Though we've been focusing so far on the pleasure-pain axis, I think there's far more to genetic engineering, transhumanism, and rewriting the genome than simply amplifying our capacity for well-being. It will also be possible, clearly, to enhance motivation, to enhance our capacity for empathy and the desirable traits of character too.
Two standard sort of counter-arguments to your line of reasoning tend to be the following. On the one hand, there is the concern that having a consistently good life is in principle impossible, because there might be some universal law of contrast. You cannot have the good without the bad. That's an argument that I hear very often, and it seems to be believed by at least a sizable proportion of the population. So I would like you to comment on that. And the other argument is sort of a sociological concern. So people have read Brave New World, and I know you've written a very extensive critique of Brave New World. And indeed, like when we mention these possibilities, very common reaction is, well, the elite will probably use biotech to control population, makes us happy pigs, completely unaware of more possibilities, and just submit to their power. So what would you have to say to these two counter-arguments?
Okay, there is no fundamental law of nature that says that organic robots have to be unhappy even part of the time. It's not like conservation of electric charge or something like that, where the positive necessarily cancels out the negative. Yes, intuitively, the idea that if one is having gradients of bliss, then somehow the dips will somehow be unpleasant, and that somehow pleasure and pain are largely or even wholly relative. But sadly, one only needs to look today at those people who are chronically depressed and or in pain. In many cases, they will not, at least in the more severe cases, never actually have experiences above hedonic zero. In the case of some severe depressives, they can't even imagine what it is like to be happy, or even what the word happiness means. Now, is one really going to tell them that somehow, because they can't contrast their misery with happiness, that the misery is somehow less real? And conversely, one does get so-called hypothymic people who more or less their whole lives are spent above hedonic zero. Sure, some of their days and some of their experiences are even more wonderful than others, but it's not as though the dips are somehow really unpleasant. A more mundane example, and well, perhaps celibate philosophers shouldn't talk about these things, but consider two people making love. Some aspects of love-making may be even more enjoyable and rewarding than others, but it's not as though the aspects that are merely very pleasant, as distinct from sublime, are somehow really unpleasant. And so this argument that pleasure and pain are purely relative just doesn't seem to hold water. The second objection you raised was Brave New World, and intuitively won't ensuring a population that is invincibly happy lead to a situation where the ruling elites are controlling and manipulating these passive dupes who are drugged up on soma or something like heroin. In fact, one can almost turn this objection on its head, in that it is depression and low mood that is associated with subordinate behaviour. Indeed, depression has been described as the internalised correlate of the losing subroutine, and that other things being equal, raising people's mood, level of well-being, actually makes them more engaged, less prone to be submissive, to exhibit subordinate behaviour. And the sociological dynamic of a society in which there weren't any depressives, in which we all led lives animated by gradients of intelligent bliss, it's almost as if you've got the opposite problem to that of a society in which many people exhibit learned helplessness, behavioural despair. So, no, I don't think that objection is tenable. One other aspect of Brave New World, if you recall, is soma. Soma, though it does induce euphoria, it's a very shallow, one-dimensional, hedonistic well-being, with hedonism connoting something very shallow, amoral, one-dimensional, whereas the use of biotech should enable us to enjoy an immense multi-dimensional spectrum of rich experience. So one shouldn't conceptualize pleasure drugs as simply a case of getting high. I mean, sure, in some sense, extraordinary well-being could be dismissed using this kind of terminology, but if instead of getting high one spoke of rich, sublime experiences, tremendous diversity of different states of well-being, this would put a different gloss on it. Just one final point, I think this is quite a common worry. Aren't these wonderful new biotechnologies going to be accessible simply to the rich elites, or at best simply to the affluent West? I don't think one should dismiss this out of hand, but it's worth recalling that any information-based technology will most likely have a cost that tends to zero. It's not as though the substrates of well-being need to be rationed, and if you look at any new technology today, anything from new drugs to mobile phones, yes, initially it is the privileged rich elites, but they very, very rapidly filter down to the rest of the world, such that now in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, you'll find people who are in many ways extraordinarily poor. Nonetheless, they will have their mobile phones, their smartphones. If a new version of Microsoft Word is introduced, then everyone in Thailand can have it within the same week. Information-based technologies are not the same as traditional material goods, and that once one has the expertise and understanding to, for instance, sequence the genome, to use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and create designer zygotes and the like, the spread of this technology to the rest of the world will be very, very rapid indeed.
You mentioned the fact that intuitively lots of people do think that, I don't know, like hedonistic experiences are are ultimately void or shallow. It seems to me that this intuition comes from the naive realist idea that experiences are only authentic when they are like legitimately representing a state of the world. So when you mention the possibility of people experiencing bliss induced with biotech, oftentimes they may think, well, it would be an illusion because actually the state of the world is not does not merit this kind of experience. It would just be hallucinating well-being, and therefore it would be fake or lacking in value. So what would you say about this?
It's absolutely vital that that we should be planning global well-being. It's not a matter of individuals seeking simply to maximize their own well-being, and that until we can ensure that all sentient beings enjoy invincible bliss, one is going to want to retain the functional analogues of some at least of today's nastier Darwinian emotions, such that, for instance, to retain critical insight, one will want to retain the functional analogues of low mood or anxiety. And so, yes, it can't all be done at once. But in the long run, why should bliss need to be earned any more than, let's say, vision needs to be earned? To have visual experience, it's not as though one should need to work for 20 years and then have the capacity to represent the visual world. It's innate. And likewise, I would say for hedonic tone that we should all be born with an extraordinarily rich hedonic tone, and go on from there. I would hope to amplify it further.
So let's say that yes, you've got somebody convinced in this line of reasoning. Practically speaking, what sort of likely path towards global well-being do you envision? And very practically, like for students, people who might be deciding what to study, what career to have, and also research universities that are thinking about how to allocate resources, what would be a general line or path that would enable this or accelerate its occurrence?
I think the biggest obstacles to phasing out the biology of suffering are ultimately ethical, ideological, not technical. So, though I would most certainly urge anyone with any kind of scientific inclination or background to get involved in the biosciences, to study molecular biology, neuroscience, clinical psychopharmacology. I also think there is a role for philosophy, studying ethics, even marketing and PR, distasteful as this might be. How suffering is going to be purged from the world, clearly this kind of crystal ball gazing, as I said, any concrete predictions I give are likely to be mistaken. What I would love to see, but I'm perhaps sceptical, will happen is some kind of nasty example, Manhattan Project or something like the moon landings, a coordinated international effort to reduce and then abolish physical pain and also the genetic predisposition to experience emotional pain. More realistically, I think it's going to start with individual prospective parents who have their own genome sequenced using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to pick the characteristics of their future children. Interestingly, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is used most commonly today not in the advanced, rich Western countries, but in India and China, to avoid the misfortune of having a girl. Now, one could argue that our priorities are rather skewed, that we should be aiming to have happier, healthier children instead. It's worth noting too that anyone who is extremely worried about this question about what is or isn't natural, that pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is not in the strict sense genetic engineering. One is simply choosing variations that nature has thrown up naturally. I most certainly do think we're going to be heading for an era of designer zygotes in which we do sculpt and engineer and author transhumans and then post-humans who do have a level of intellectual, emotional, and who knows, spiritual sophistication that is physiologically inaccessible now, but nonetheless that's in the future, in that simply by using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis one could dramatically reduce the burden of suffering.
So in a sense, all that we've been discussing so far is to an extent agnostic about the specific animals or creatures or beings that these technologies or the imperative is predicated on. Nonetheless, in popular culture as well as in media, like the notion that we should care deeply about the well-being of other sentient beings besides humans is not particularly stressed. If anything, it's like an afterthought. Nonetheless, in all of your work, you maintain that eradicating suffering throughout the living world is actually just as big of an imperative as eradicating it in the human species. So, would like you to comment a little bit on it, like why the distinction between human and non-human animal is morally irrelevant, and what sort of policy could we have such that we make sure that non-human animals are not subjected to involuntary suffering?
Clearly only a minority of people, huntspeople perhaps and the like, would actually favour any activity that was conducted with the deliberate purpose of creating non-human animal suffering, but nonetheless most people have a very clear sense of ethical priorities, that humans come first, our species. However, if you consider, let's say, a pig is as sentient and, for what it's worth, also as intelligent as perhaps a pre-linguistic toddler. A pig can suffer intense distress, and yet meat-eating humans do things to pigs that, if our victims were human, would get the perpetrators locked up for life. And so one way of appreciating the extent to which we need to consider non-human animal suffering is to actually think of non-human animals as in many ways functionally akin to small children, to pre-linguistic toddlers or infants, and to attach just as much urgency to their well-being as if these sentient beings belong to our species. Now, intuitively, any kind of moral equation of a pig, let's say, and a pre-linguistic toddler strikes people as absolutely absurd. And after all, only a toddler has capacity to mature into an adult human being. But one simply needs to ask, how should one treat a toddler with a progressive disease who will never reach his or her third birthday? We would recognise that that toddler deserves at least as much care and love and respect as his or her normally developing peers. I mean, we respect and care for very young children, not for what they may or may not one day become, but for what they are. And likewise, I would say, is exactly the same is true of pigs or sheep or chickens, for example. Okay, more concrete initiatives. By far the greatest source of severe, chronic and readily avoidable suffering in the world today is entirely man-made, and that is factory farming. So I would say that we all have an obligation to give up eating meat and animal products and make a transition to a cruelty-free vegan lifestyle. Now, intuitively, many people's reaction, this is crazy, it would involve heroic self-sacrifice, but this is not the case. One simply looks at cultures like those of the Indian subcontinent that have been either vegan or vegetarian or quasi-vegan for thousands of years. It's a lifestyle choice. Realistically, given moral apathy is so widespread, I think we should develop technologies of in vitro meat, cultured meat, such that within the next few decades it will be possible to make a global transition to an in vitrotarian and vegan lifestyle. But since gourmet in vitro steaks are probably still decades away, I don't think this should be used as an excuse to carry on factory farming and causing suffering as now. And to someone who says, but I like the taste of meat too much to give it up, I would simply say, well, how would one respond to someone who abuses human children who says, well, I like the taste too much to give it up? The fact one enjoys the taste of something is not a morally compelling argument, and I'm aware that any comparison of animal abuse and child abuse strikes people as extraordinarily emotive, but if one accepts that a pig, say, is of comparable sentience to a pre-linguistic toddler, the parallel is precise.
I think a common reaction as well is to try to anchor some sort of distinction. We have the strong intuition that humans deserve more love, affection, and care than non-human animals. Intuitively, we search for a dividing line. Something that is often confounded is the difference between conscience and consciousness. Something you hear a lot about is, well, pigs don't talk, therefore they're not conscious. Or otherwise, they may say that, well, a sense of morality is only possible to be predicated on creatures that may reciprocate somehow. That something that cannot reciprocate really doesn't deserve sort of ethical standing. But so what would you say is a compelling reason to think that these distinctions are, say, irrelevant morally?
Well, one only needs to look at the way we treat human babies and toddlers. Simply because they are not capable of developing sophisticated moral reasoning until they mature, this doesn't mean to say that we haven't got a profound moral obligation to safeguard their well-being, and it's exactly the same, I would say, with pigs or cows or sheep. That what matters is not intellect, it's the capacity to suffer. And although I suspect intuitively most people have this dimmer switch model of consciousness or sentience, with humans at the top and non-human animals a long way beneath us, all the way down to something like worms or something like that. But actually, if you look via electrode studies and the like at the actual molecular substrates of consciousness, the most intense forms of experience are also the most phylogenetically primitive. Something like pain or panic or orgasm are mediated by very primitive structures in the brain, whereas the handful of structures and molecular pathways that distinguish human from non-human animals, i.e. let's say the variant of the FOXP2 gene implicated in our capacity for generative syntax, these don't seem in any way really to be related to intensity of consciousness. So yes, it's ultimately an untenable distinction, I think, between humans and animals. It's pre-Darwinian, it's unscientific, and we should be aiming for an impartial benevolence that regards all sentient beings as worthy of consideration and respect. In short, some kind of high-tech Jainism. I say high-tech Jainism because ultimately I think our responsibility to non-human animals extends beyond simply avoiding harming them as we do today, but ultimately to actively safeguarding their well-being in our future wildlife parks. Later this century, every cubic meter of our planet is going to be computationally accessible to micromanagement, surveillance and control. So we're going to have to take some very difficult ethical decisions. How much pain and suffering do we want to create or perpetuate in the living world? What kinds of life form? And that in tomorrow's wildlife parks we can either continue to see population regulated by famine, disease and predation, or we can, for example, use fertility control to control herbivore numbers via the use of immunocontraception. Now you might say, well, we could never really totally phase out suffering because there's the food chain. One has predators preying on herbivores, or prey as they're sometimes called. But once again, this is an instance of an ethical problem that has a high-tech solution. If we wanted to do so, we could either phase out carnivorous predators, or alternatively we could tweak their genomes, use behavioural modification, neurochips and the like, to prevent them harming other sentient beings. And in spite of the rather warm associations that the idea of nature, wildlife conjure up in most humans today, if you actually look at the rest of the living world, what it is to be a lion for instance, is to cause immense suffering to one's victims, to be disemboweled or asphyxiated or eaten alive is horrific, whether one is a human or a non-human animal. And just as we now recognise that human predators need to be restricted in some way as to protect the innocent and the vulnerable, I think later this century and beyond we will extend our benevolence to non-human animals and recognise that a zebra does not deserve to be disemboweled or asphyxiated or eaten alive.
I think a common response to that line of reasoning is that, well, ecosystems are highly chaotic systems. It would be very difficult to identify specific interventions that would guarantee that the whole ecosystem doesn't collapse, while at the same time guaranteeing that there is no disemboweling or like other horrific manners of death or suffering. Do you have any thought on that? Is really engineering ecosystems to have a evolutionarily stable, steady state of non-suffering possible?
Yes, in a nutshell. For a start, it's not a question of shall we intervene in nature or not. Humans are already intervening in nature on a truly massive scale, ranging from uncontrolled habitat destruction to captive breeding programs for big cats, rewilding and the like. So once again, it's a false dilemma. Is the problem computationally intractable? Well, it's certainly complicated, but nonetheless there are only at most half a dozen levels in any trophic web of the food chain. One will not, and I said one will not, if we accept that we do have a responsibility for a compassionate nature as well as a conservation biology, that if we do accept this ethical obligation to minimise involuntary suffering, one would start off doing pilot projects in particular wildlife parks. And already today, in spite of the common injunction not to, inverted commas, interfere in nature, Something like immunocontraception is used in the Kruger National Park in preference to the brutal practice of culling elephant populations. And likewise, starting at, and I'm scare quoting the terms, at the top of the phylogenetic tree of the large free-living vertebrates that probably are capable of sustaining the worst forms of suffering, we could, in principle at least, introduce the principles of the welfare state for the, first of all, with the higher vertebrates, and then working our way down the phylogenetic tree. Something like, for instance, a welfare state for elephants, African elephants, might cost between $2 and $3 million a year to implement, if we regard it as ethically desirable to take care of the old, the sick, the young, and the vulnerable.
And eventually going all the way down to, say, mice?
Yes, I said, though one can envisage something like this for large, free-living, long-lived vertebrates now, it will be possible to go right the way down what is cruelly called the food chain. Clearly, if we're talking about mice, let alone small invertebrates, this is not going to be a priority right now. In fact, in the case of small invertebrates, it wouldn't yet be feasible. But with the exponential growth of computer power, surveillance and control technology later this century, with power comes complicity. There's essentially going to be no cubic meter, no cubic millimeter even, of the planet that isn't computationally accessible for surveillance and control.
So with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes, I said godlike power. I said whether or not you think we should be exercising this power to phase out the substrates of suffering, we are going to be acquiring this power. And whereas right now, if terrible things are happening in the jungle or the African savannah, one feels, well, it's not immoral because it's not our fault. If right now you saw a small child in a shallow pond who was drowning and didn't pull him or her out, you would be culpable. Likewise, later this century and beyond, if we don't rescue other sentient beings who are suffering, we will be no less culpable, I would say.
The range of ideas that you've expressed so far in this interview are greatly emphasizing the pain-pleasure axis, and to an extent different expressions of those standard human feelings and emotions, such as motivation or jealousy, and which ones would be desirable. But if we look a little bit further into the future, there might be lots of other expressions of possible experiences that are completely unexplored so far. Something that I find actually very admirable of your work is that you're not, so to speak, enclosed with the belief that the human experience is all there is to life. And whereas you have sort of two general camps of people who talk about consciousness, you have people who are very sloppy thinking, who say, well, there's this wide variety of conscious experiences that have different meanings, significance, spiritual realms, and so on and so forth. Then you have hard-headed academicians who might say, well, all of that is complete fantasy. What matters is what you can see, what matters is what you normally experience. You, on the other hand, recognize that there's a very vast state space of possible experiences that are underexplored. And in particular, you've expressed that psychedelics, for example, such as LSD or DMT or salvia, unlock state space of consciousness that in the future might be of incredible significance. I don't know, I would love if you could comment a little bit on that general topic.
Yes, from an ethical perspective, I think our priority lies in phasing out suffering. Now, in terms of knowledge, quite a common criticism is that, well, if we were happy all the time, we wouldn't be motivated by intellectual curiosity. It would bring progress to a juddering halt. On the contrary, one of the many blessings of ensuring the substrates of invincible well-being is that invincible well-being will enable us to explore radically altered states of consciousness without the possibility of so-called bad trips. Because part of the problem today with taking drugs that induce radically altered states of consciousness is that they are unpredictable, and one can't in advance make an informed choice about what one is letting oneself in for. But in future, as I said, once experience below hedonic zero becomes physiologically impossible, one can be certain that however strange or outlandish or weird these altered state spaces of consciousness are, they will nonetheless be hedonically rich. Yes, what we call ordinary waking consciousness, or just most of the time, yes, just consensus reality that is treated as the gold standard for knowledge claims, is just one state space amongst many. It seems to have been the one most conducive to helping our genes lead or copy themselves on the African savannah. But if you compare the difference between sleeping consciousness and waking consciousness, seems to be a whole multitude of state spaces that exist that are largely unexplored. In some cases we aren't even physiologically capable of accessing them. Perhaps it's worth stressing that I don't think simply taking different drugs offers the royal route to enlightenment, just as someone who's congenitally blind to an operation gives the gift of sight to. Takes them months or even years to be able to navigate state space of visual experience, and in the case of someone who's given the gift of sight, they have a predigested conceptual scheme of sighted people. If one were to take a drug that, let's say, induces echolocatory experience in the way one might imagine, let's say, a civilization of hyper-intelligent bats, for instance, nonetheless one would be intellectually completely out of one's depth. And this is how I see these altered state spaces, that in many cases they will not have been recruited by natural selection to play any information processing role, not as yet. They are inaccessible to classical digital computers, and even humans who start to explore these states, their significance at first will be completely opaque to us. But just because we won't at first be able to make sense of them doesn't mean to say that they're intellectually unimportant in the same way as a tribe of congenitally blind people who try a drug that induces visual experience. Yes, the drug taker there will be right in divining that this visual experience is significant, even though nothing in his conceptual framework has prepared him for what has been unlocked.
So in a nutshell, you're saying psychedelic takers are experiencing the phenomenal expression of senses we don't have, and are trying to convince us that such thing as intellectually valuable, but we don't really have anything, a way of harnessing that.
Very much so. It's purely a contingent matter that what we call visual experience is for the most part locked onto tracking spectral reflectances. As one knows from, let's say, something like dreaming, there is no indissoluble link between stimulation of the retina and visual experience. Visual experience is simply a mode of experience that natural selection has harnessed for information processing purposes. In the case of something like synesthesia, for instance, sight and sound can be transposed, and I would regard a lot of these alien, outlandish state spaces of experience as, yes, no necessary connection between any information processing role. They may or may not one day be recruited for. They are potentially at least intrinsically interesting.
One thing that you've written a lot about is the concept, well, trying to make a sensible, trying to make it sensible the concept of a super intelligence. I know there's a lot of diverging opinions on what super intelligence could be. You tend to emphasize the ability to experience a full spectrum of phenomenal experiences, and also having full control over what such experiences may be.
What is superintelligence? Very difficult question. What someone says about what is the nature of superintelligence tends to be obliquely autobiographical. We don't understand what intelligence is. Take a dozen researchers and they'll give you a dozen different accounts. If one is specifying the minimal preconditions of post-human superintelligence, the intellectual capacity of superintelligence can in no way be inferior to humans, and amongst other things humans can do, well, let's go through a list of things. We have a non-arbitrary metric, a way of distinguishing the important from the unimportant and the trivial, absolutely critical to intelligence, and this is provided by the pleasure-pain axis, whereas some accounts of superintelligence, for instance, suggest that the alleged superintelligence might find paperclips important, which strikes me as a manifestation of autism spectrum disorder rather than superintelligence. So that's one criterion, some non-arbitrary criteria, some touchstone of the important. Other things that a notional superintelligence must be able to do to solve the binding problem. How is it that it is possible for a central nervous system or its digital analogue to bind edges, shapes, textures, motions into bound objects apprehended by a unitary self? So you need to ask, what is this alleged entity that is superintelligent, and how does it solve the binding problem? Full spectrum superintelligence must also be capable of empathetic understanding. If one looks at what drove the evolution of distinctively human intelligence, it seems to have been, together with the generative syntax, seems to have been our superior mind-reading capacity for cooperative problem-solving, perspective-taking. So that's another feature of full-spectrum superintelligence. One other ingredient, as I said, this is a list of necessary conditions and extremely partial. Superintelligence will need to be fluent and have mastery and control of a multitude of different state spaces of consciousness. Nature of consciousness is clearly a vexed issue. Some way we don't yet know how to solve the hard problem of consciousness and the binding problem, but classical digital computers are not sentient now, and I think there are powerful theoretical grounds for saying that they will never be non-trivially sentient, whereas we know that organic nervous systems are conscious, can solve the binding problem, and can talk about, reason about, and explore different states of consciousness. So, putting this all together, yes, post-human superintelligence will be vastly superior to humans or today's existing classical digital computers in the kind of narrow IQ sense of intelligence, verbal skills, logico-mathematical reasoning processes. So we'll have immensely greater serial depth of processing, but at the same time we'll also have this full spectrum of abilities. And some theorists, who are broadly known as singularitarians, believe that it will be possible to have recursively self-improving software-based minds. They combine Moore's law, i.e. the exponential growth of computer processing power, every 18 months or so, with this notion that in the future this hypothetical unitary software-based minds will somehow be created and be able to edit and recursively self-improve themselves. And either on a kind of Kurzweilian vision that humans and artificial intelligence will merge, starting off with cybernetic implants and then moving on perhaps to some kind of uploading scenario in which we scan, digitize and upload ourselves to a less perishable substrate. Or, and this is another current of singularitarianism, this idea that such is the nature of machine-based intelligence, recursively self-improving software-based minds, that most likely primitive organic robots, biological humans, are effectively going to be consigned to history unless we devise something such as so-called friendly AI. Now, the idea of a superintelligence that exhibits human friendliness, we don't even yet know whether this idea is intellectually coherent. It wouldn't, at least on the face of it, be intellectually coherent to speak of a superintelligence that was Aryan friendly or cannibal friendly, likewise defining friendliness in some species specific way seems to involve a very gerrymandered notion of intelligence. But on this school of singularitarianism associated with I.J. Good and more recently with the singularitarian, with the Singularity Institute for Artificial Intelligence, humans are actually likely to be replaced by machine superintelligence. Those two scenarios deserve a lot more consideration than I'm actually going to give here, because I want to at least raise another possibility, which is that organic robots, i.e. us, are actually going to master our own genetic source code, and with the assistance of machines, AI, tool AI, are actually going to bootstrap our way to full spectrum superintelligence. Earlier in our discussion we touched on the reproductive revolution of designer babies and the way that prospective parents are going to be choosing genetic makeup of their future offspring. This intuitively would play out over generations and is too slow to make a difference compared to the tempo of accelerating machine intelligence. But recall that it's also going to be possible to, for adult humans, to edit their own genetic source code. Now, at first blush this sounds rather implausible. Surely most of us aren't going to become molecular biologists. We're not going to be capable of mastering the intricacy of 3 billion odd base pairs, but recall that within the next 10, 15, 20 years or so, we're going to witness the creation of extraordinarily user-friendly gene authoring, editing and software tools with tremendously powerful user-friendly interfaces that will shield us from some of the messiness and complications. And starting with individual genes and then clusters of genes and ultimately hundreds of genes and alternative splice variants, it will be possible for biohackers, as one might say, to edit their own source code in a recursive runaway spiral of self-improvement. And the smarter you think that artificial intelligence is going to be, the more that AI will enable us to intelligently manipulate and control our own genetic source code.
So, something that you definitely touch a lot on is this association with of superintelligence, as you previously mentioned, and empathy. Like you even have the term of empathetic superintelligence, and I mean clearly we have a cognitive hardware that predisposes us to lots of very interesting forms of empathy. Actually, you can detect whether someone likes someone else by whether they're imitating their style of speech or the vocabulary that they employ. But it seems to me that to an extent probably we have this very strong association of empathy and positivity because we are hardwired to have such association. Um, from a purely evolutionary point of view, I imagine that when a recursively self-improving sort of intelligence loop happens with individuals changing their own genetic makeup, changing their cognitive abilities, although I would really, really definitely wish and prefer the possibility that the runaway intelligent loop selects for highly empathetic individuals. I can also see the possibility of conscious, organic, recursively self-improving robots, or humanoids, only selecting for the cognitive abilities necessary for their own well-being or for their own power. And even though there might be other instances of individuals who would be recursively self-improving with a concern for the well-being of others, there would probably still be a fraction of such runaway loop who would be sort of entirely self-concerned and would shun away any sort of sophisticated metaphysical understanding that would allow them to understand that the self-other distinction is fictional, or so on and so forth. So just I'm not entirely convinced that the pairing happens naturally of empathy and superintelligence.
I suspect quite a lot of AI researchers would think of empathy as a very kind of second-rate form of intelligence, and will confuse it with the mere personality dimension of agreeableness. But in fact, an empathetic understanding is extraordinarily cognitively demanding, and it's worth recalling that what it is like to be another subjective experience, what it is like to be able to apprehend fourth, fifth, and even in the case of someone like Shakespeare, sixth order intentionality is as much a property of the natural world as the rest mass of the electron. So insofar as one wants to actually understand the nature of the natural world, one is going to want to understand other subjects of experience. Now, most of us, it is true, for good evolutionary reasons, are not mirror-touch synesthetes, and we don't feel the pain of others as if it were our own. We don't experience their perspectives as though they were our own. But I think with greater full spectrum of superintelligence, as one actually comes to understand the perspectives of other subjects of experience, that as one starts to obtain this godlike capacity to impartially understand all possible subjects of experience, this will entail expanding our circle of compassion. It is not possible, if you are a mirror-touch synesthete, to act in an unfriendly, hostile way to another sentient being. And I would see a generalization of mirror-touch synesthesia as part and parcel of being a full-spectrum superintelligence. That any supposedly intelligent being that doesn't understand the nature of consciousness, that doesn't understand that there are other subjects of experience as real as yours or mine like now, is in a fundamental sense ignorance. And if we're talking about superintelligence as distinct from malware, superintelligence is not ignorant.
Yeah, and on the other hand, like genocides are not necessarily ignorant of the fact of the suffering they're inflicting. Nonetheless, they might not have the phenomenal expression of sort of feeling the other person's pain.
No, I mean, what is the actual nature of knowledge of another person's another subject of experience? In the case of something like genocide, or all that we regard as most obnoxious in history, would seem to stem from metaphysically false beliefs about the nature of infidels or Jews or what have you. And I think we can be confident that superintelligence will not entertain false beliefs or a false conceptual framework.
I see. So, in a nutshell, the argument goes like this. If a conscious entity is capable of accurately representing the other person's experience, it would understand that it has the significance that it actually has.
I mean, a superintelligence, just as to understand the natural world via science, one knows that one cannot privilege some here and nows, that one needs to aspire to this view from nowhere, this godlike perspective. Likewise, in the realm of experience, that for sure the world seems to be centered on me. My pains seem to matter more than that of another sentient being on the other side of the world. But this is simply a fitness-enhancing illusion that's explained by natural selection, and that insofar as one is capable of achieving this godlike capacity impartially to represent all possible first-person states, then yes, one will not privilege one particular perspective over equivalent states of sentience elsewhere. It's illusory.
You seem to be a little bit on the minority side in terms of the predictions that you have for the capabilities that digital computers will have. And it relies on, your ideas rely on a very particular or a very particular theory of mind, so to speak. With a functionalist theory of mind or a computational theory of mind, there doesn't seem to be a reason why a digital computer properly programmed wouldn't be able to experience life just as we do if you add the proper inputs, you add the proper isomorphisms of information processing, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if I understand your metaphysical conception of the world, it would be something along the lines of idealistic monism, where there is one thing, and that's consciousness, that it happens to be shaped in all sorts of different ways. You can correct me if I'm terribly wrong. So, I mean, so there are like these different conceptions of reality and the relationship of consciousness and the universe. What I'm really interested in is ways of testing these different possibilities. So how would we go about testing whether a functionalist account of the mind is right, or whether you are right in that respect?
Perhaps a more accurate description of my position would be micro-functionalism, as distinct from the coarse-grained functionalism of critics. Before going any further, perhaps it's worth stressing that no one need buy into my perhaps idiosyncratic conception of the nature of mind and consciousness to endorse the notion that we should phase out the biology of suffering.
Yeah.
Though I find philosophical issues of mind and consciousness interesting, they aren't integral to the abolitionist project.
So they're merely descriptive, well, much more descriptive than prescriptive.
Yes. In terms of yes. Okay. Here is an example. If I were to give you the moves of a game of chess I have played, you could faithfully recreate the gameplay, but on the basis of the moves, you would know absolutely nothing whatsoever about the texture of the pieces, or even whether they had any textures at all. Perhaps I played the game online. Now, you might say, well, the textures of the pieces, they don't really matter. We've captured the functional essence of the game. But the big difference between humans and the game of chess is that if humans or other sentient beings were mere zombies, i.e. if it wasn't even all dark inside but it didn't feel like anything at all, nothing would matter. So the textures of consciousness, by analogy with the textures of the pieces of chess, are at least as important as the gameplay. Now that assumes that these textures are functionally incidental or irrelevant. Now this remains to be shown. For what it's worth, I personally think that it cannot be the case that some kind of epiphenomenalism is true, that the textures of consciousness are causally impotent. For a start, epiphenomenalism is a perspective that, if it were true, would forbid its own articulation, that causally impotent epiphenomena couldn't cause us to allude to their own existence, let alone explore them. And some of us at least spend a fair bit of our lives exploring different varieties of consciousness, or in the case of more mainstream scientists, exploring the neural correlates of consciousness. It's by no means clear that a classical digital computer could do this. What would the software executed by such a program notionally imagine that human psychonauts were doing, for instance?
What about this following scheme to sort of differentiate the two theories? In order to sort of test the course for functionalist, connectionist model of the mind, let's say I have a silicon chip that is essentially a layer of synthetic neurons, or at least like functionally equivalent to neurons, not at the molecular level, just merely their action potentials. And you replace one layer of neurons in a person's brain with this chip that functions as intermediary between two parts of a brain, such that if it was the case that all the information processing that the brain was doing was contained in the pattern of activation of the neurons, such pattern would remain. It would go through the silicon layer, but nevertheless it would be the same information processing. Would you think that such experiment could be illuminating, or would you be very skeptical of the results? And of course, like, you can ask the person after you do the experiment, well, has your phenomenal experience changed at all whatsoever?
This is true. I am personally skeptical whether such a system would be capable of replicating object binding, phenomenal object binding, or a unitary self. And to highlight the computational advantage and the extraordinary computational power conferred by the capacity for object binding or a unitary self, it's merely necessary to look at particular neurological syndromes where binding even partially breaks down, ranging from florid schizophrenia to simultanagnosia, where a subject can only see one object at once, to cerebral achinotopsia or motion blindness, where the subject cannot actually apprehend motion but simply sees in individual frames. And so I would be very skeptical that this artificial brain could solve the binding problem. Recall that though in one sense computers, digital computers, classical digital computers, are making extraordinary progress, we have to confront Moravec's paradox. This why is it that a bumblebee, for instance, is far more sophisticated in open field, unstructured contexts, its behaviour, than anything that the Pentagon can come up with, and no one as yet really understands how the organic mind-brain solves the binding problem. I have my own speculations, but yes, one cannot simply imagine that it is straightforward simply to imagine replacing organic neurons with silicon neurons, and they will be functionally isomorphic.
Well, say they conduct experiment and the person doesn't have it. The person continues having phenomenal binding. There's absolutely no problem. Maybe even some mild cognitive enhancements. Would that change your views on the matter?
Well, indeed, this would falsify this particular conjecture.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Usually, metaphysical theories don't are unfalsifiable. It's very fresh to hear the possibility.
Yes, as I said, I would. What would seem to be idle speculations on my part do yield definite predictions. I would predict that classical digital computers will never be non-trivially conscious. I would predict that if and when it is possible to inspect mind brains on sub-picosecond timescales, it will be possible to actually capture the formal shadows of quantum coherent states. So yes, what might appear to be idle philosophical musings could be tested and operationalized.